Money may not make the world go round, but in the 18th century, it was sure causing a revolution. At the start of the century, peasants were unaccustomed to the laws of supply and demand and believed everything should be sold at a reasonable rate, called the just price, and rallied against anything that didn't conform to this model. However, mechanization of production and increasing numbers of tradesmen meant luxury items began to fit within the just price model, at least in urban settings, and the consumer revolution was born. The consumer revolution was the new consumerist attitudes and growth in consumption in Europe in the mid to late 1700s. Instead of simply buying necessities, people began to purchase such opulent items as a stove, a divider to separate the kitchen from the bedroom, and even their own personal soup bowl. This paved the way for the modern consumer economy we have today. Whereas before money was spent almost exclusively on practical items like livestock, it was now being spent on non-essentials. Europe had the highest rate of consumption the world had ever seen. Consumption of goods, that is. The appetite for a slew of new items was exploited by manufacturers who adopted a new strategy of marketing. The bombardment of advertisements, which we encounter every day, began to arise. Producers learned that they could create demand for their products by making them trendy. If the aristocracy could be convinced to purchase something, it would catch on. Part of what fueled the consumer revolution was this desire amongst the middling orders to live like the wealthy nobility and royalty. Cheap knockoffs like fake porcelain and a price drop on fancy imports began to make this dream a reality. Of course, the nobility couldn't very well have the same luxuries as a lowly commoner, so they, too, began buying more lavish items.
Nowhere did the growth in consumption manifest more clearly than in the world of fashion. Clothing, especially for women in France and England, began to change rapidly, with every new trend crazier than the last. For example, when the hot air balloon was invented in 1783, the balloon inspired shirts, pants, and even hairstyles. Although trends were previously set by what the nobility wore, in the face of a new, ever-changing fashion world, the nobles had to race to catch up. As the nobility had to keep buying the clothes that were in vogue, they amassed a large collection of last season's outfits. These were passed down to their servants, who either wore, sold, or repurposed the garments. This provided common people a gateway into the wondrous world of the wealthy. For the first time, the common person began spending a significant portion of their income on clothing. This was furthered by the growth in the textile industry, which made clothes even cheaper for the average consumer.
But what really got the working class excited was that they could finally achieve the pinnacle of European sophistication: throw a tea party.
While the peasants still ate bread and vegetables, the middle class could afford beans and fruits. Though the gentleman's diet of mostly meat was still out of the question for common folk, the middle class could now buy exotic items like tea for a taste of the good life. Enslaved people in the colonies labored to give Europe more goods to export and trade to bring such new imports to market. This led to new treats, including chocolate, coffee, and tobacco. Since tea and coffee had caffeine, they kept people awake in their increasingly demanding jobs. These jobs let them make and produce more goods, giving them more money. And more money in production meant more luxury and, most importantly, more tea.
Of course, this cycle was perpetuated by the fact that tea, caffeine, tobacco, and, to a certain extent, chocolate were all addictive.
People became hooked on these luxuries that they didn't need or have a century ago. These goods, however, were only produced in the colonies. The colonies were once expendable, mere, cheap sources of resources which depended on their motherland. But now Europe relied on them to supply their lifestyles, and when you depend on someone, they hold power over you. But that's not till next chapter. Anyhow, the new consumerism had several other important impacts on society.
First, it meant people were sharing ideas. Coffee brought the coffee house, where average people could talk and conspire. Previously, this role in society was filled by the tavern, but it turns out you get very different ideas when you're drinking caffeine instead of alcohol. This contributed to the second effect of the consumer culture. The middling orders began to value themselves as individuals. It began early in the century, when lowly peasants pretended they were honorable nobility during carnivals, but soon the epidemic spread. The ignoble masses began to spend money on themselves and buy unique items to express their personal taste, or lack thereof. They developed something of a sense of self-identity and individualism, fostered by their ability to choose their own purchases and attire. Aristocrats, meanwhile, had to retain their lofty status and identity in a new way. Instead of relying on their external displays of rank, they began to refine themselves internally, gaining education, sociability, etiquette, and a demeanor which could not simply be bought and sold. Thus, they scorned the uncouth carnivals and recreations of the commoners. Especially improper were blood sports like cockfighting, bull baiting, or bear baiting, which were shunned in favor of the much more civilized boxing match.
Thirdly, consumerism offered another alternative to violent entertainment: reading. While reading rates were already on the rise in Europe, reading was not a common pastime. Reading was for the Bible and its commentaries. More than half of London's book market in 1700 was religious titles. Fiction meant to entertain, not educate, was practically non-existent. Consumerism changed this as the average person began to actually buy books for their own enjoyment. This new market brought a plethora of varieties of writing. One could choose from religious chapbooks, moral-filled fairy tales, political pamphlets, practical almanacs, or a new, melodramatic type of book called the novel. These new genres increased interest in reading for groups like children and women, and also further raised the literacy rates throughout Europe. The greater variety of books led to a greater variety of ideas, and radical Enlightenment thoughts quickly spread. Those who couldn't read were surrounded by enough who could that authors' ideas finally reached everyone in society. Along with more books came more plays, operas, and operettas, which all could enjoy. Works like The Magic Flute had cringeworthy jokes for the drunken masses to laugh at, like Papageno's comedic role. But they also commented on the ideas of the times. The Magic Flute shows the Brotherhood of the Sun, a Freemason-esque group, saving the prince from the deceptively evil kingdom of the night, bringing him into the enlightened light. The new literature did more than just spread philosophy, it seeded and cultivated a culture. In the previous centuries, the aristocracy paid the artists to manufacture culture, as the peasants were too busy trying not to die to develop intricate customs and artworks of their own. Thus, culture remained controlled by the elite patrons. However, by the 18th century, the monarchs had their hands full simply trying to stay in power. The consumer revolution meant art, fashion, and luxuries were being produced for the masses. The populace had a culture. Pop culture and consumerism were concentrated in cities and nowhere near as impactful as they are today. But the 1700s still set the stage for the Industrial Revolution and birth of modern society. Viva la Consumer Revolution!